What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a sponsored video for Black Geyser, Couriers of Darkness. This video being brought to you by the developer and publisher, Grape Ocean Technologies and Vicarious Publishing, respectively. The game itself will be launching tomorrow, March 17th, for the price of $29.99. You can find a link to the Steam page down below, but let's talk about what the game actually is. Black Geyser is a cRPG inspired by the classics of the genre, such as Baldur's Gate, Icewind Dale, and thus bears some resemblance to more recent titles like Pillars of Eternity. So if you've played any of those titles, you'll feel right at home with this one, which is itself, again, a cRPG with a real-time with pause combat system, a huge map to explore and roleplay in, and the title's greed system, which is probably the most unique system that we'll see here, in which your player actions impact the world's greed level, which will change how the world reacts and behaves in the face of the ongoing conflict between the two powers of the capital of Isilbright and the mining town of Darren Gould. So the big setup for Black Geyser is that there seems to be a curse of greed slowly spreading throughout the land, corrupting and changing people just by its very influence. And obviously we get caught up in these events and must slowly unravel the mystery of why this is happening, in addition to our own place and the legacy of our birth and how that relates to this. But with no further ado, let's jump into the title via this new player's guide, teaching you everything you need to know about playing Black Geyser, starting with character creation. So character creation is going to see you picking from one of 5 races: humans, dwarves, elves, Feldegug, or Rillo. Now, I would say most people are probably familiar with human, elf, and dwarf. Feldegug are sort of snow elves, so very similar to elves. And then there are the Rillo. Rillo are interesting in that they bear a passing resemblance to elephants. They have tusks growing out of their face, and they all sort of worship this demigod of theirs. And they have a pretty interesting culture overall. Now, the most important thing to know about picking each one of these races are what they're going to do for you stat-wise and class-wise. Now, humans can be every class. However, they take a -1 penalty to their maximum supernatural, which is one of the ability scores we'll get into here in a bit. And then all of the other races also have restrictions on what they can be class-wise. Now, the dwarf gets the most restrictions in this regard, but beyond class restrictions, each race is going to give you plus or minuses to maximum stats, as well as resistances to certain types of damage. Now, overall, there are 13 classes to choose from, each of them taking up a space of one of 4 archetypes, that of a cleric, a roguish outlaw, a fighter type, or a mage of some sort. Now, each of these classes will have its own individual stats and things that determine how good they are with certain types of weapons, what type of armor they can wear, etc. However, you can pick up to 3 of these classes to make up a multi-class. Now, the downside to doing that is while you can kind of offset some of the weaknesses of the class, you will actually be increasing the experience required to then level up. And for each and every class type, if you just hit the stats button, you can see exactly what they get. For instance, our Highlander here gets +3 to their physique, and a slightly varying bonus depending on their level to heat, cold, poison acid, pulse and blow, which is a damage type, and they get +1 weapon skill points per level. So Highlander is a really good fighter. They just can't wear heavy armor, for instance. And then for our secondary class, I'm going with Necromancer. They can only wear robes by default. However, because I have the Highlander class, I'm actually going to be able to equip medium armor. And when I go with this Necromancer class, I'll also get access to spells that are available to that class, as there are a wide variety of spells in the game, with each caster class being able to learn a mix and match variety of them. Some spells are exclusive to certain classes, whereas some of them can be shared by individual ones, which we'll talk about a bit more later. But as it stands now, we've got 5 races, 13 classes. We can multi-class up to 3 of those classes. And once you've decided what you want to play, we move on to attributes. Now, attributes are pretty straightforward. If you've ever played a role-playing game, you'll pretty much know what these are for. You got physique, dexterity, intelligence, focus, and charisma, as well as supernatural. All of these stats are going to influence their child stats, if you will. For instance, physique will affect your damage dealt with physical attacks, your maximum health, your ability to evade incoming attacks by blocking, as well as your carrying capacity. Whereas dexterity will modify your aim and accuracy value, your chance to evade attacks via dodging and parrying, etc. Now, supernatural, I would say, is the one people would be less familiar with overall. And this basically what makes your character above standard versions of that race, if you will. So this is going to increase your character's resistance values against all sorts of damage, and enable further special abilities for warriors and outlaws, and increase the number of elevated energy spells wizards and priests can cast. Now, when it says warriors and outlaws, wizards and priests, that means every class of that related type. So any class that is considered a warrior, such as a Highlander or a standard fighter, would benefit from that in that way. But basically what this means is that increasing supernatural is going to give you more special ability uses for warriors and outlaws, and more spell slots for wizards and priests of a specific type. So supernatural just makes them able to use their abilities more often. And then we have skills and spells. So this is divided into general, class specific, and weapons. General are pretty straightforward. Bargain and persuasion is pretty much your standard charisma persuade ability. Learning and research is your ability to just read various things, such as scrolls and recipes. Scrolls can be scribed if you are the appropriate class to know the spell and scribe it to begin with. And you can learn recipes that will lead into crafting. So learning and research blends a little bit with brewing and drying. Brewing and drying is essentially your crafting skill, and we'll talk a bit more about that later. And then we have our class-specific stuff. So the important thing to know is that class-specific stuff is specific to your class. What you see here depends on your class. We see the mage version as well as the warrior version because that is what we picked in character creation. If I were to pick an outlaw or a cleric or priest class of some sort, I would see different abilities here, because each class will get about 4 or so unique abilities that they can use. Now we'll be able to distribute points to these and kind of build our character in the way we want. So if we were to pick Seasoned Warrior or Prodigy, we would get dialogue options specific to either a warrior or a mage in some way. A warrior can force locks and doors, whereas an outlaw or a rogue type can pick instead. They can also pickpocket. A mage can see magical perception and warding, which lets them disarm magical traps, whereas an outlaw can disarm regular traps. Warriors can pick up Command Company, which allows them to give party-wide buffs and act as a leader. And there's a lot of stuff you can do with the class-specific skills that really kind of make individual characters stand out. And as such, because of these class-specific abilities, it's a good idea to keep a very robust party composition, which we'll talk a bit more about later. Now, then we have our weapon skills. Our weapon skills are very straightforward. It is your skill with that weapon. Ideally, you want to pump points into the weapon that you're going to be using the most, as this is effectively your chance to hit. The more points you have in a weapon skill, the more likely you are to hit something with it. Now, this is less important for caster classes, as they're unlikely to be hitting anything physically and relying more on their spells, for instance, but warriors, etc., really need to focus in on the weapons that they're going to be using the most and specializing a bit so that they have the maximum chance to hit possible. And then below that, we are going to pick our initial spells if we get any. So if you are picking a class that gets spells, this is where you'll pick the ones that you have. It will show you the level 1 spells, basically, that character can learn. And then from there, we pick our appearance and portrait, finalize our character, and move on to the actual game. So before we jump into the game properly, it's important to understand this greed mechanic. The entire world is affected by a greed level, and your actions as a player and party will affect that level. So if you go through the game being like, give me money, I'm only doing this because of the reward, that's going to increase the world's greed level, and the world will react accordingly. Moreover, as your character becomes well known, these choices and how you approach them will actually have more impact as people know more about your character and your party. And before we start exploring the UI a little bit, just know that if you press tab, you can highlight all the items around you, which will make finding things pretty easy. But from there, let's start breaking down the UI and talking about some of the game's mechanics. So for starters, the rest mechanic, much like D&D or Pathfinder, you need to rest. This is going to recharge your spell slots for the day, your special abilities if you are a warrior or an outlaw, as well as heal you a little bit. Now, you can rest anywhere, just like the old cRPGs. However, doing so does open you up to the potential of an ambush. Even in cities, this can happen to you. The idea that you're being like mugged, etc. You can instead choose to rest at an inn, which offers a bit better healing, a choice of rooms for buffs, etc., and probably more importantly, protection from attack. Now from there, let's talk about our character's inventory a little bit. Now this is pretty standard if you've ever played any of these kinds of games. However, I want to draw your attention to the quick slot area. For starters, we can have 2 weapon sets that we can switch between. We have a spot for potions and powders, as well as general consumables. So this is where we are going to put our potions and our consumables to use in combat. Otherwise, if we're in combat, they won't be available to us. Now, the other tabs that we can see here above our actual inventory are brewing and drying, which we will talk about just momentarily. But first, let's talk about the actual interface when we have our character selected. So if we have a group of adventurers and we have them all selected, we won't see this. But if we have an individual character selected just above their portrait, or the line of portraits near the bottom there, we're going to see a few icons and then a hotbar of sorts to the right. Now, the first icon is spells and special abilities. This is going to show you your spells and special abilities, as you might imagine. So if you're a mage, it will give you a list of all the spell levels that you know. Then you can choose them individually and pick the spell you want to cast while you have the game paused, I would imagine. And then the second button above our portrait is our class-specific skills. So this is where we're going to go to use our trap disarm, force a lock, pickpocket. If you're a cleric or you have a priest in your party, they can actually abolish curses from items as one of their class skills, which is pretty useful. But that button is where you're going to click to find those things and actually use them. And then the third icon is our consumables tab. If we have any potions, etc. equipped, that's what we're going to click on to use those. And then that last button with our bow and arrow there, that is our weapon set toggle. That's how we're going to toggle between any weapon sets that we happen to have equipped. But from there, let's talk a bit about magic. So for starters, how do we learn spells? Well, a couple different ways. If you are a spellcasting class, you can learn some spells as you level up, but you can also find scrolls out in the world. And if you right-click those, you can see in the item description what magic classes can actually learn this spell. So in this instance, we can see that the spell Summon Spider is learnable by a Convoker, a Spellweaver, or a Necromancer. So if you can't learn a spell, usually it's because your magic class isn't on that list. And then if you can learn it, you should see the Scribe Spell button right there at the bottom, and that's going to teach you that spell. But now that we have it, where do we go to set it up? Well, if you press V or click the Spellbook button, that is going to bring up your spellbook. This is essentially the spells you are going to have memorized. Now, spells are divided up into base energy and elevated energy. This is essentially two different types of spell slots. Elevated energy is the very useful stuff, and then base energy are kind of like your standard spells, if you will. Each level of spell will be divided into these two categories, but this is where you will memorize your spells, and then you have to rest before they become available, as your spell slots are usable once per day. Now, assuming that you're all prepped and ready for combat and you want to attack something that is not hostile, all you have to do is press the sword icon in the bottom left of the UI and then click on the non-hostile target and you can attack it. Now, you can attack pretty much anything. However, there will be repercussions, of course, for doing so. Just like there are repercussions for stealing items, if you barge into somebody's house and take things you're not allowed to take, those characters will often turn hostile and attack you. You can get attacked by guards, etc. So there are consequences to those actions, but you can do them. And from there, let's talk a little bit about the crafting system, which is brewing and drying. So drying is essentially making the raw materials for potion crafting or anything else really. This will require you to have the raw ingredients as well as a heat source. Now there are some temporary heat sources, and then there are lanterns. Lanterns are a permanent heat source that actually has varying heat levels, which can make your life a lot easier. You can buy one very early on from the blacksmith right as you enter the capital. Now, brewing is going to let you brew things, as you might imagine, potions, etc. However, this requires a cauldron, which you can also get from that same blacksmith right at the start of the game. And you can experiment if you want to and just kind of throw ingredients into your cauldron and brew them. However, you can also find recipes throughout the world, and reading these recipes will add them to your recipe book, provided you have the learning and research to do so. And once you've done that, you can actually click on the brewing tab, look at the recipes you know, autofill the recipe, and then just click brew and you're good to go. Which I mention because this is actually a fantastic way to make money early in the game. There are a couple of recipes that kind of just get handed to you. And if you take the time to go buy that cauldron for like 100 gold, you can make some very simple potions that require very simple recipes and turn around and sell those potions for like 100 gold a piece and make a ton of money and get your characters equipped very well right in the capital before you even really start the game. Now let's talk about leveling up a little bit. So when your character does level up, as you might imagine, this is a bit class dependent, but you're going to get a point in your general skills, a point into your class skills, points into your weapon skills. The amount of weapon skills you're going to get is going to vary depending on what you know, and then you're going to get spells and abilities. Now, if you have a multi-class, exactly what you get here is going to change a little bit, but special abilities are for your fighter and your outlaw. These are essentially combat abilities that they can use in some way, be that attempting to knock a character down, go into a rage, etc. That's where you're going to find these, and this is where you're going to learn them. And then if you are using a caster class, you will occasionally have the opportunity to learn spells as you level up, if you don't already know them from reading scrolls. Now let's talk about the world map a little bit before we move on to combat. So the world map is very reminiscent of the original Baldur's Gate. So if you're familiar with that world map, you'll kind of know what's going on here. But basically, whenever you leave an area, you'll essentially just go to the edge of the local map that you're on until you see the little arrow icon that indicates you can leave. You'll click that, and then that'll bring up the world map. However, where you exit each individual map from matters, because this is what's going to reveal the next location on the map. So in order to leave from Hidden Cabin to Merchant's Road, we have to leave from the part of the Hidden Cabin map that is facing Merchant's Road. And this is how we discover and find different areas on the map and can kind of explore a little bit. Now, there are a few exceptions to this for the story, but generally speaking, that's how you're going to explore and fill out the world map. And there is a lot of optional exploration stuff for you to find that's going to require you to just move around and do this. The main story isn't going to lead you to everything, as this is largely a 60+ hour game. Now let's start talking combat a little bit. But before we jump into combat, we first might want to gather up some companions. So real quick, I'm going to go over the companions you can find very early on in the game to give you a full party. However, these are not the only companions in the game by any means. These are just ones available right at the beginning to quickly give you a full party to really help you out at the beginning. So for starters, on the Merchant's Road, we will run into a dwarf. He can act as a fighter for you. He'll join your party pretty much right off the bat. And then from here, we're going to go north to the capital. And in the capital, we can find the other three. The first two are going to be right in the Market Square district. If we go right up next to the temple, we can find our cleric, Soraka, being attacked by some thugs. If we help her out, she'll join our party. And then we can find our mage in the tavern in the same district, the Market Square. Her name is Bajala, and if we help her out with some people hassling her, she will join our party as our mage and can actually help us out a great deal with the main story as well. And then last but not least, we can find Hamlin in the Greybark district. Right as we go south from Market Square, we'll run right into him. It is apparent that he was stealing something from a merchant, and we can help him out here, and he'll join our party as well. Now this will give us a full party with all of our bases covered in terms of party composition. But let's talk about how to set these guys up to fight on their own. So if we pull up our party sheet, which we can find on the bottom left of our UI, or we can press P, this will bring up our companion controls. This is where we are going to set their sort of limited AI and how they choose to attack, whether or not they use their per rest spells, how cautious they try to be with their area of effect, or do they just friendly fire all over the place, that type of stuff. You'll be able to set that here, as well as the formation of your party as well. And then when you get more companions, because there are more, again, you can also go here to actually manage your party. Now, as you start adventuring and using party members, you might actually just level your party up, because in addition to character levels, there are also party levels. These are going to allow you to pick a cohesion and diversity perk. These are very strong buffs, basically, as your party levels up, that can do things like reduce your chance of being ambushed during rest, give you extra damage if everyone's attacking the same target, things like that. These are very strong perks, and they definitely should not be ignored. But somewhere in all that adventuring, your party members might just die. So what do you do about that if you don't decide to reload? Well, you can go to a temple in any major hub. The capital's going to have one right off the bat, right where we find Soraka. And temples are available as healers as well as resurrection. Now, on the difficulty of the game that you've chosen up to this point, because there are 4, how you resurrect them can change. On the regular difficulties, resurrecting a character will just give them all their equipment. On veteran, I believe, which is hard mode, the character will be resurrected without their equipment. And then on the highest difficulty, it's actually permadeath. They can't be resurrected at all. So you do have some options there. But from there, let's talk about actual combat. Now, as I mentioned, this is a real-time with pause system, meaning that combat will be taking place all at once. You're going to be pausing to make tactical decisions as well as pick your spells and abilities that you're trying to use. So first and foremost, you're really going to want to set your companion's AI behavior to act in the way you want or adjust to the situation. And then from there, you're really going to want to be pausing to give your characters directions to get the maximum effect out of this. Because if you just let the combat run, there's a very good chance that if you're not trying to use any sort of tactics, etc., your party is going to be overrun. So the main thing is right when combat starts, you really want to pause and give your characters directions. So for instance, for the character that we've made in this, our Highlander Necromancer, one of the early spells he can get is Poison Weapon. Despite being primarily a fighter, he can now poison his weapon via a Necromancer spell to give him a little extra damage in combat. So at the start of combat, I'm going to want to activate that ability to actually get the benefit of it. And then while I'm doing that, I'm going to want to set up my spellcasters to do their thing via summoning creatures to help distract enemies, or make sure they're actually attacking with their spells. Because if you don't set up your combat AI, there's a very real chance your casters might just be trying to melee the enemy, which isn't going to do us any good. So the main things to watch out for in combat are positioning, making sure your tank is actually soaking up most of the damage, that your fragile guys are in the back. Make sure your casters are actually casting spells and not trying to melee things. And then last but not least, don't forget that your warriors and your outlaws have special abilities. You're going to want to use those to get the most effect out of your warriors, etc. Because if you're just having them stand there and swing their weapon, that might not be bad depending on, the quality of their weapon and their hit chance. But if you use the special abilities available to them, you're going to get a lot more damage out of them. And you can even do things like stun your enemies, etc., which is going to give you a lot more depth to the combat and get the most out of your character progression than anything else will. There you go, guys. A sort of crash course beginner's guide into how to play Black Geyser, which is again releasing tomorrow on the 17th for $29.99. But all that said, I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you found it informative. And if you did, please remember to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.